New editions of Dungeons & Dragons and many other role-playing games are inevitable for several reasons. The main ones being ones of finance, and that games intended to draw upon the imaginations of the players must evolve to encompass the evolution of the imaginations of their players. We of certain generations can sit there and say how a particular edition doesn't particularly meet our expectations of this or that game, but we have to remember the intended audience for the game. This has always been, excepting the very first iteration, ages 8 and up for Dungeons & Dragons. As of this video, I'm in my 50s. Can I truly relate to something written with kids of that age in mind? Well, the answer is yes and no. It's probably fuel for an entirely different video, but the point here is that any game must be evaluated against its expected audience, with a caveat that games such as Dungeons & Dragons can appeal to an audience of a broad spectrum of ages and ideals, because the not-so-shocking truth about imagination is that everyone has it, everyone's use of it changes throughout their lifetime, and everyone's manifestation of it is different. Anyway, back to the main theme, inevitability of editions. Generally speaking, a new edition, or partial edition, of Dungeons & Dragons has emerged every 5 to 10 years, or thereabouts. 1974 to 77, 77 to 81, 81 to 83, 77 to 85-ish, 85 to 89, 89 to 96, 96 to, well, you get the point. The financial side of it is that, widely recognised, a company engaged in a niche hobby of role-playing needs to resell its bestsellers, in other words, its core rule books, periodically in order to keep the cash flow up. The evolution side comes in that if that reselling doesn't appeal to a wide audience, there's a problem. To make it appealing to a wide audience, you need to look at what your current target audience looks like and appeal to them. Market research, all of that. This obviously causes a lot of, I've been playing for 300 years and this no longer looks like the game I fell in love with when I was 8. Trust me, I have that experience too, to some level. But that in essence is, in the business side of things, a non-starter. So, inevitability of editions, that's where Dungeons & Dragons finds itself now, with the 2024 edition of the 5th edition of the game, and the 6th iteration of the game since its reformation by Wizards of the Coast in 2000, by which I'm counting 3, 3.5, 4, Essentials 5, and now 2024. And this is my video giving that a once-over. One of the first things that came over to me when 2024 was announced was, looking at all of the 5e materials I'd amassed, was this new edition going to work with all that? In the past, the answer to this question has been variable. AD&D First and Second and Basic D&D were all relatively compatible, more or less, with minor differences that could be managed on the fly, or, since the statistics were similar enough, ignored and used as on the page. Basics, Armor Class 9, and AD&D's Armor Class 10 represented the same thing, but when all's told, what's the real difference between a single point of AC? When Third came, virtually everything that had come before was rendered obsolete. If you wanted to play a 2nd edition adventure with 3rd edition, you'd have to do some major rewriting and rebalancing to make it work. Similarly, 4th. With the advent of 5th, you could take 5th stats and apply them to whatever edition's monsters and NPCs and use an adventure otherwise as written, more or less. This, for me, was one of the greatest parts of 5th's design. It reopened my entire library of D&D material. So what, from 5th to 2024? Well, rules-wise, pretty much all as it was before. Some name changes. Inspiration to heroic inspiration, some tweaks to how things actually operate, generally mostly falling under the heading of clarification rather than new. Some incorporation of ideas floated in works such as Thanasar's Guide to Everything and Tasha's Cauldron and Everything, much in the same way that 2nd edition incorporated some of the ideas from later AD&D books such as the Unearthed Arcana and the Survival Guides. The core of the rule system is pretty much unchanged. Good news then. with the caution to cross-check with the newly rejigged class features, pretty much everything 5e works just fine with the 2024 set. About class features. Now this goes more for player characters in general, and this, I think, is where the majority of the differences exist. Traditionally, the D&D rules have prompted you to pick a race and then a class, because back in the early days certain classes were closed to certain races, and so you needed race first to dictate what classes you could choose from. And then other stuff to augment your race, class and character theme choices. In fact, you were first prompted to roll your ability scores, as these, in some editions, limited choice of race, class or both. Now, you select your class first, and then species, then background, and roll and assign ability scores, and then pick up the augmentations and ancillary stuff such as equipment. This actually makes more sense. For a start, most of the players I've known have always had class concept in mind before doing anything else. I want to play a fighter, I want to play a wizard, and so on. So this shift is really one reflecting how the game is actually played versus how the rulebooks have expected people to play. The class chapter, chapter 2, starting on page 33, actually I'll pause for a second to explain in one of my gripes about the new books, equally applicable to the old, so it's a perennial issue, not just a 2024 one. The new Player's Handbook is 384 pages long. The 2014 Player's Handbook is 316 pages, ignoring the character sheet, and cross-references itself a lot. But page numbers are not included in those cross-references. It does a lot of see this part of the book, where it could easily have gone a little bit further with the inclusion of starting on this page, or even a simple page number in brackets. That would have been a massive leap of usability. Anyway, back to classes. A nice table starts the class chapter, giving a complexity rating to each class. Throughout my years of DMing, I've urged new players to start with fighters or thieves, rogues, as their first character, while new players have often gone, nope, wizard for me. It's nice to have a codification of complexity right there up front. The classes themselves have been tweaked somewhat, largely to use the same language and similar touch points within each. For example, subclasses are now called subclasses for each class instead of primal paths, bardic colleges, divine domains, and so on. Common language makes things much easier to cross-correlate and explains to new players. Trust me on this. Some class features have been tweaked, some have been brought in from other sources. Each class now has 4 subclasses in the core, so some have been dropped and some have been added. Some have been renamed. Path of the Totem Warrior is now Path of the Wild Heart, for example. Generally, though, not a huge amount of change. Something a little daft, in my opinion, is the inclusion of ability score improvement on the class tables. This is intended to make feats a compulsory thing, with ability score improvement now a feat instead of an option to take instead of a feat. It's the default feat that you get, rather than something in place of that feat choice. I think I would have preferred just to say feat here. I've never come across any 5e players that don't use feats, so the default, and even this or that of 2014, has always seemed a bit clumsy. But perhaps I'm wrong and feats aren't as widespread as I think. Let me know whether feats are a thing for you, or do you just stick to ability score increases instead? There is, in some corners, a hoo-ha about the change from race to species, which I don't care about. Plenty of games have used the term species for decades, and it serves to reinforce that all of these different beings are not simply risen from the same stock, just with pointier ears, greener skin and whatnot. That assumption also explains the mash of ridiculous half-breeds the game has had floating about for some time. So now, a reinforcement of different beings being different. Crediting this to, say, wokeness or some other ephemeral concept that some people use without being able to provide a coherent definition is, well, daft. Background is, in my head, a mix of profession and culture and goes beyond the definition of background in the 2014 iteration of 5e. Ability score adjustments, for example, are moved from race, species, to background, which makes a lot of sense. Background describes what a character has been doing prior to going out adventuring, and so should have a bigger say in what the character's core basic look like. However, A nice inclusion is a note on page 38 of the 2024 Player's Handbook, and one of a few that contribute towards the 2024 iteration being compatible, to a large extent, with 2014. This note quickly and easily shows you how to translate races and backgrounds from 2014 into species and backgrounds within the 2024 rule set. I've added a couple of page references into the previous to illustrate another new concept for the Player's Handbook. That is, it doesn't follow the traditional concept of diving straight into character generation first and then going into rules. Instead, it goes into rules and then, after 30 or so pages of that, goes into character generation. I think this is not a bad way to do it. One thing, especially new players, I've found struggle with is the concept of what all of the numbers and such actually mean to the game. Explaining all of that up front means that engaging in the process of character generation is a more meaningful exercise. The 2024 Player's Handbook also continues the 2014's iteration format of not having half or more of the book taken up by spells. That's down to 5e's minimisation of spells in the first place. One Cure Wounds spell over multiple Cure Wounds spells of different severities, for example, and no cross-duplication of spells that do the same thing, but slightly tweaked in one way or another according to class. The book is finally rounded out with an overview of the planes, some creature stats used for familiars, summoning, wild shape, and so on, and, nicely, a rules summary that short forms the rules from the beginning of the book into a more easily referenced compilation. And so that's the core of it all. The Player's Handbook, which, since 3E, forms the cornerstone of Dungeons & Dragons. We start this section asking the question, is this new? And breaking down the Player's Handbook is the logical way to answer that. And the answer is easy. No, it's not new. It's demonstrably the same game as was in 2014, with some tweaks here and there based on 10 or years or so of 5e being in the wild, and remembering that D&D's target audience is 8 or more. Someone who was 8 in 2014 would now be an adult in 2024. I think it's testament to the strength of 5e's design that it needed so little tweaking to bring over a decade of evolution. The 2024 DM's Guide is similarly expanded, 384 pages versus 320 in 2014. The sections are similar, running the game, creating adventures, creating campaigns, treasures, all of this kind of stuff, with some new additions. The DM's Workshop is now the DM's Toolbox and covers a number of odds and sods, including creating monsters, magic items and such. While the subjects covered in these sections are similar to those in the 2014 book, most have been expanded upon and are clearer in execution. Bastions is a new addition to the game, being some stronghold managed by the player characters for their R&R time. This for me breaks immersion in the setting somewhat, but otherwise it's an interesting inclusion. An overview of the Greyhawk setting is included, complete with map from a 576 CY timeline. The date presented for the original World of Greyhawk folio and box set from the early 1980s. For those that know Greyhawk lore, this predates the Greyhawk Wars, so Ayuz has yet to conquer the Northern Lands, or may never do so if you pick up Greyhawk as your 5e setting from the book. The world is presented as something to use, but is also an example of what can be done using the campaign construction guidelines presented in the DM Guide. Another addition to the book is the Lore Glossary. This delves into brief descriptions on worlds, gods, people, places and objects famed from throughout D&D's history. Personally, I'm not such a fan of this section. For me, Dungeons & Dragons is a game of the imagination of the DM and players at a given table, and everything else is simply material to save time. It has grown, however, across the editions into a more solid canon. So here we are in 2024, where Igwil, Tiamat, the Sword Coast and so on are woven into the fabric of the game, rather than them being parts of settings and such parallel to the game. I guess a franchise needs its recognisable bullet points. There are some useful forms scattered throughout the book: campaign journal, travel planner, game expectations and so on. On this latter, there is something that has grown over the years as part of a greater awareness regarding mental health and triggers. Personally, I find it more useful to know your players than to codify things into such a form, but many groups find this sort of thing useful. From an overall perspective, this is a worthy DM guide. It is the 5e Guide Plus, with more stuff stuffed into it than its 2014 counterpart, and more helping hand material than any of its predecessors prior to 5e. I have to say, I am very impressed by this book's content. Again, the Monster Manual of 2024 is expanded from its 2014 counterpart, 384 pages versus 352. Despite rumours and misinformation, there is nothing from the 2014 manual that is missing here, although a chunk of things have been rejigged. An example here is with regards to humanoid beings, now presented as player species within the player's handbook. Instead of these carrying over their own entries, as did, for example, orcs in 2014, they are now represented by NPC monster entries. So orcs are there, you just won't find them under the heading orc. Where monsters from 2014 don't have specific entries anymore, a table of equivalents is provided in the 2024 book. So, for example, if I'm looking for Orc War Chief, the 2024 manual directs me to use Tough Boss as an equivalent. In this manner, the number of humanoid-type variants available has increased, because any species now has the full range of NPC stat blocks to draw upon. Well, they always did, but them having their own sections did default people to using those rather than extending the list of possibilities out further. And now that is explicit. While nothing has been lost in this way, the space freed and the additional space added has brought more monsters into the core book. Yes, there are more monsters in this book than there were in the 2014 volume. Some monsters have been revised with some inclusions. For example, lopped-off troll limbs can continue to operate as they regenerate. Some odd ones that are sort of understandable from a certain perspective. Goblins are now Fae, for example, and gnolls are now fiends. This somewhat ties in with the sort of things we will see in Baldur's Gate 3, with dead hyenas bursting forth new gnolls, and enables a separation between humanoids as playable beings and all of the rest as something else's. Stat blocks are similar, having undergone an overhaul in organisation, but pretty much everything from the 2014 edition remains compatible. The book's organisation I'm not a fan of. Red dragons, for example, are now listed under red dragon rather than dragon. Hill giants under hill giant rather than giant. This is a bit annoying, as I like all of those major categories in the same place within a book. But hey-ho, it's not a game killer. Now I feel I have to mention this because I am paying a premium for hobby books, so I expect a minimum quality level for paying that premium. Here is where the 2024 Dungeons & Dragons books fall short. The paper used feels like it wants to tear every time a page is turned, and the binding has a similar look to it as did the 2014 books. If the same quality is used in that regard, I'm expecting to need to rebind the books in roughly 2 to 3 years, as I had to do with my 2014 ones. This is far from premium quality. It especially bites as rival RPG companies, Chaosium for example, are producing better quality books for roughly the same retail price. Tariffs, overheads, whatever, I don't care. If you expect me to pay premium, I expect premium in return. So while I am happy with the 2024 books content-wise, I remain unhappy with the physical quality of the books. It's a shame. I like the 2024 edition. I think it retains the general feel and flexibility of 5e, while adding a bunch of refreshing rejigs and, importantly, not obsoleting my burgeoning library. I don't sign to the woke rhetoric at all. It's irrelevant. And at this point, I feel the culture wars are little more than any older generation feels when faced with the newfangled stuff of the new generation. It's part of human existence, and it certainly isn't encapsulated in a funny little game about tapping into one's imagination and killing a bunch of dragons. 5e remains one of the better incarnations of Dungeons & Dragons and, in my opinion, a good bit of polish has been added to it in this 2024 iteration. We'll see what the future has in store for D&D as it unfolds, but I don't think this is a bad foundation to continue the game forwards.